Our great nation is shrinking and we need someone to pay the pensions, so... You.
Yes?
You need to get pregnant right now.
Says who?
Well, fascists as well as communist dictatorships and more recently, Silicon Valley tech bros. Don't you want to support your nation?
But what if I don't want babies?
That is out of the question. Why wouldn't you want babies? Also, who cares if you want them? Aren't you merely a woman?
I am indeed a woman, a totally legitimate form of a human, and I don't want a government to tell me when and how to have babies.
Fertility is going down. So is this something to worry? Maybe not, Maybe it is. It depends on what perspective you have. For the environment, it's maybe good not to have so many babies, but as a personal preferences, you might want to have more babies, or for a pension scheme, it's good to have many, many babies.
Increasing the share of father days in parental leave packages, it actually had an anti-natalist effect, unfortunately, because the more time fathers spent with their kids, they realized they didn't want to do childcare, and then they ended up having fewer children. And I'm definitely not saying this.
Sorry, that sounds horrendous.
Yeah,
they
I know.
just realized they don't want these kids around, any more of them.
For certain men who have this family image as a status symbol, it is good for men's health, and it also is a sign for having higher income. But for women, it's rather a disadvantage still.
Hello, welcome back to the Standard Time Talk Show. I'm your host, Reka Kinga Pop.
And I'm Daniela Nivaso, the writer of the show.
On this program, we discuss European culture, society, and politics with guests from all over the world. We release new episodes every second week, so don't miss out. Hit the subscribe button and set 5 to 7 alarms so you never miss an episode. By the way, you can also watch the show or listen to it in a podcast format on Display Europe. And don't forget to turn on the subtitles in one of the 15 languages Display offers. Have you given birth this week? Not yet? What have you been doing all this time? Across the globe, developed nations are freaking out because of the decrease in birth rates, and this fuels ever fiercer culture wars and some very gendered propaganda. Quote, since the collapse of socialism, demographic change has emerged as one of the biggest Rashomons of contemporary societies, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. End quote, says Christian Fidanowski, a doctoral candidate in social policy and demography at the University of Oxford. Indeed, birth rates have been steadily decreasing across the world for the first time since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. Russia and China have been struggling with its effects for decades, but much of Europe and countries like India and South Korea have recently started to contend with this phenomenon. In the past 2 centuries, since 1804, the global population has grown from 1 billion to an astonishing 8 billion people, thanks in large part to greater agricultural productivity and medical advancements. World population growth hit its peak at 2.1% annually in 1968, but has since slowed to 1.1%. So now the demographic concern has shifted from a fear of overpopulation to a concern with hemorrhaging polities. Pronatalism is on the rise once again. It's a favorite pet theory shared by so many, including both fascist and communist dictatorships and, more recently, Silicon Valley tech oligarchs. They are advocating for having more children in order to increase the number of people in a country, with very weird undertones. Unfortunately, this political drive often takes the form of restrictive policies, for instance, the opposition to effective birth control and abortions. It often also has strong racial overtones and sometimes class implications, like Elon Musk specifically advocating for wealthy people to have more kids. Of course, it's not like the Earth is running out of humans. We're more numerous than at any time throughout the history of our species. Yet, in a political and economical mindset tuned to the idea of perpetual growth and measuring national economies against one another, there is rising resistance against immigration, even when our economies are built on immigrant labor, quite like in Europe and specifically the European Union. Now, despite the questionable tech bro bullcrap, there are good reasons to be concerned. Our economies, especially in welfare states, are built on a model where active generations of wage earners provide for their contemporary dependents, through an intricate system of taxes and dues that sustain healthcare systems, schools and pensions, and sometimes even paid parental leave, the most extreme version of an active holiday anyone can ever take. Here's political scientist Ivan Krastev talking about population decline in South Korea.
In South Korea, they have a reproduction rate which is under 1%. Obviously, something is dramatically wrong with the South Korean marriage and so on. But as a result of it, if they're not going to change the trend and if they're not going to be migration, they're going to lose half of its population in the next 20 years. So now imagine the economic, political, and security implications. This is a country where kind of the biggest military divide which remained from the Cold War is still there. Can you imagine that you're a leader in a country and you know that basically in 20 years you're going to lose half of your population? I'm saying this because when you go and start seeing this, you start to see totally different reasons why governments are doing what they're doing.
You can listen to Krastev's conversation in full with Mirjana Tomic at the Presse Club Concordia on the link up in the card here and in the video description. So, is there a way to remodel our economies so that fewer people can provide for more dependents? Not only are birth rates decreasing, so is the relative taxation of the highest earners across much of the globe. Are we ever going to entertain the idea of maybe taxing the rich? Oh, hell no. Let's blame women instead. Yeah, some way, somehow, it always finds a way to make it all about the control of the female body. One interesting characteristic of this discourse is that it tends to focus very heavily on gender norms, societal expectations, and put a lot of pressure on the people who dare not utilize their wombs for reproduction. Why is it so centered on them? For societies that widely promote the idea of the nuclear family, I would expect to see howling packs of eligible bachelors roaming the streets in search for a lifelong mate to have and raise babies with, and yet this doesn't seem to be the most successful calling card on Tinder. But why are we having fewer babies, let's say in Austria or Japan, in Washington DC, even in Luxembourg? Okay, maybe not in Luxembourg, but only because they have a very positive immigration-emigration rate, but you get the point. But seriously, why are the people with wombs choosing to have fewer babies? Oh, they are career-focused workaholics? Believe it or not, someone made the foolish mistake of asking them. Two sociologists, or as I like to call them, sociologists, Claudia Rahnfeld and Ann-Kathrin Heuschkel, decided to make a deep study on the subject and found out something interesting. So drumroll please. And I quote, "The decision to become childless is made much more on the basis of individual motives and not because of the framework conditions, which was previously assumed. The main reasons for women are a desire for self-realization, free time, and more freedom. These motives are far ahead of other motives such as the ecological footprint." End quote. Ha! Free time. I raised 3 awesome yet tiresome children, and I'm not sure I remember exactly what free time was. It's been a while. Yet, the level of freedom and free time varies wildly across social strata and societies. For instance, where universal childcare is available, where public education and healthcare systems are dependable, versus where parents have to spend a significant proportion of their income just to be able to go to work to have any income whatsoever while somebody watches their kids. We have an episode on kindergartens, my favorite things in life. Maybe you want to check this out. Link up here in the card and down in the video description. It's important to note a surprising fact, however. According to new research, and despite all the shame and blame, it seems that childless women have not only been ever-present and important pillars of our communities and wider society, but also rather numerous across the past century. For example, in Austria, they constituted 29.1% of the population in 1900. Power to the antis! Having children or not having them is such a deeply intimate and personal question that many legitimately want policymakers to take a step back and instead of exerting pressure, maybe rather provide circumstances so that the babies people want to have can actually be born and raised, respecting people's individual lives and decisions. I was among the first ones in my age group to have a kid and have often been asked since whether I found it worth it. It's a weird question, but I try to take this seriously because it's asked seriously. After all, the last thing an uncertain young adult needs is a lecture from someone who hasn't slept through a night for years. So, my very sincere answer has always been, no, it's not worth it. If we run the calculus on invested time, energy, and resources, having children in our societies is not a profitable investment for the individual. I love them, and I wouldn't want to live without children. But if you don't have the motivation, the personal motivation, the same tally for you may never add up. I believe that our kids don't owe us allegiance or gratitude or even their time, to be honest. Their lives are theirs, and our joy in raising them is just a side product. A marvelous side product, but not the point of the exercise. I know this sounds grim, but it's at least an honest response, which allows you to try and make your own choices and explore what you want, as opposed to what would be kind of, like a financial irrational choice. And who knows, you may be an enthusiastic parent someday, or you may end up the best auntie or uncle for an extremely thankful bunch of kids and their tired parents who appreciate you being there for them. And you may enjoy not having to be there for them all of the time. But these factors vary wildly across societal positions, individual wealth, gender, and in a gender division of labor, so many factors. We have 3 experts here with us to talk about pronatalism, population decline, and childcare. Dr. Regina Fuchs heads the Population Directorate at Statistics Austria. This is where statistics on demographics, health, the labor market, education, living conditions, research, and digitalization are compiled. She is also responsible for the Science Center with the Austrian Microdata Center. Christian Fidanowski studied politics and East European studies at University College London and Russian, Eurasian, and East European studies at Georgetown University. He's a doctorate candidate in social policy and demography at the University of Oxford. Dr. Gerlinde Mauerer, senior scientist at the Department of Sociology at the University of Vienna, Austria, primarily works in research on gender and family, empirical sociology, health, and social inequalities, as well as critical masculinities. Let's get to this. Hi, very welcome. Thanks for taking the time to meet with me and talk about whether it's worth having babies and what keeps us from having more, because apparently I'm at fault for the depopulation of the Carpathian Basin. I haven't given birth this week yet. So let's walk through the numbers. Regina, you work on statistics and specifically in Austria. Tell us about Austria. Are births declining? How are births faring with the population numbers?
Fertility is going down. So is this something to worry? Maybe not, Maybe it is. It depends on what perspective you have. So for the environment, it's maybe good not to have so many babies, but as a personal preferences, you might want to have more babies, or for a pension scheme, it's good to have many, many babies. And the last years, fertility has been going down. So we are at the very low of fertility. Last year, we experienced a total fertility rate of only 1.3. So this is the lowest level we have ever experienced in Austria. We know it's low, and we have some theories about it. There is a lot of economic insecurity. The world is an uncertain place these days. There's wars, there's the economic downturn, there's the European economic situation. There's so many factors that make us maybe not wanting to have babies, right?
I mean, we can be very extreme and say that from an environmental point of view, Genghis Khan and the Black Death were very favorable. It's not a humanist point of view. But when we talk about perspectives, it also strikes me, you say this is the lowest number of birth per capita since statistics started. It's the same thing in Hungary, for instance, this last year, which strikes me, this means that per capita more babies were born during and in the aftermath of world wars, during invasions. I know this is a very big and open question, and probably we don't have one definitive answer, but could you tell me, Gerlinde, about what are the possible factors that have changed, that persuade people to be more concerned, that make them more concerned about certain things?
So I do empirical research and I interviewed parents with children, and we know that individual financial security is a huge issue for parents. So we still have family benefits in Austria, and Austrian family benefits are very generous. However, the labor market is restricted to several professions, and we know that financial stability and financial security, especially for women, makes it difficult to have children. And so I see it as a gendered issue, and I think that family as a security, we know it also from numbers. For some men, for certain men who have this family image as a status symbol, it is good for men's health, and it also is a sign for having higher income. But for women, it's rather a disadvantage.
And there's also, as you say, this general, not everyone on the employment market, but many employers have this deep suspicion of women of, a fertile age, which is most women on the labor markets, or a huge portion of women on the labor markets, but also are extremely reluctant to employ women caring for small children. That doesn't apply to men in the same walks of life, and the aftermath of, or sort of the attitudes around parental leave is different. What I wonder whether you could tell us about is this very specific attitude in Austria of women's employment after marriage, and especially when having kids, because it seems to me that there's a higher likelihood that women will leave a workplace and not go into any regular employment after having kids. Is that true?
They are expected to leave the workplace.
Is this a cultural thing?
It's a conservative attitude. There once was a publication, Dornröschenschlaf, and that employers expect women to be like the woman they prefer to marry. And if they expect women to stay at home to raise kids, then they also expect that their employees will quit the workplace. But we know from empirical research that women start relatively early and come back to the workplace relatively early if there is the opportunity to do so, in how much your partner is involved in infant care. So that's, or the grandparents. So it's also important how your individual opportunities are in not being the only one who cares for an infant.
Christian, you recently published an article with us in Eurozine about pronatalist policies. What the hell is pronatalism? It sounds very threatening. And is there any useful side to this?
I still wonder about that a lot, despite having almost completed my PhD on the topic by now. But it's definitely, what I can say for sure, it's quite a bad conversation starter at dinner parties, for example, because it
sounds like a very specific version of techno movements or something like that.
It evokes a very clear conservative connotation, and of course we know that historically pronatalism has been associated with the Nazi regimes in World War II. Also today, if we look around Europe to see who is pursuing pronatalism, we see countries such as Hungary, Poland, Serbia, countries all of which have had right-wing or still have right-wing governments which have introduced and expanded these policies. In itself, pronatalism is a neutral term. It literally means a set of policy interventions and political narratives aimed at increasing the birth rate. So it's kind of inevitable that a lot of people associate it with conservative parties, but it might also be beneficial for us as researchers and for societies in general to try to reclaim this term, because we shouldn't allow right-wing perspectives to sort of monopolize its use. Because of course there are a lot of societal and individual benefits from having at least now that's also a bit normative, but having a decent fertility rate in the sense of maybe maintaining the current size of the population. The famous replacement level of 2.1 children per woman is clearly unattainable for most developed countries these days. But then surveys on this topic often show us that people on average would like to have more children than they're having. The average preference is around 2.5 children per woman. The actual fertility in the European Union right now is 1.5. So there's a very progressive case to be made there for policymakers to try and help people fill this gap of one additional child, right? And from a societal perspective, we know that all else being equal, maintaining the current birth rate or not allowing it to fall too low is beneficial for economic growth, beneficial for pension systems, healthcare systems, especially in East European countries where these people are also losing a lot of people due to emigration, which exacerbates some of these problems. It exacerbates the age imbalances in the population. So progressive pronatalism, where we try to facilitate the choice of being a parent rather than making it impossible not to have children, should probably be the goal of policymakers dealing with this topic. And just as a quick shout out, perhaps some of my colleagues in the UK have recently started a newsletter called Boom, which tries to do exactly this, to enable people to have a more ideologically neutral understanding of the phenomenon.
When we talk about pronatalist policies, it's not only fascist regimes that have been involved with this, and of course it ties in very strongly with this huge heritage of eugenics in a lot of sense, but it was also very prevalent in Soviet-dominated countries. So I think we can bring in here the horrendous example from Ceausescu's Romania, where abortion bans were supposed to solve the population problem. They didn't. However, they have realized in a lot of injuries and even fatalities. I think there's a lot of factors in there that these interventions don't seem to tackle. So let's come back to sort of the hard numbers and the policies, Regina. Do you see any factors that specifically interfere? Do you suspect any factors? And does any decision maker ever ask you guys about this?
As you said already, there is pronatalism all around, but we have already seen also the opposite. Let's think about the one-child family. So that's a norm which it was very successful, right? So over the years, we have seen pronatalist and also on the other hand, antinatalist policies that have been very successful. But these days, we have a lot of choice, and it seems like pronatalist policies and there is many factors that can help to increase the likelihood of having babies. So, I tackle childcare, for example, right? I have more egalitarian societies, like Gerlinde said, where men take up more of the family household work. So these are the factors that can factor in and somehow raise up fertility rates a teeny tiny bit. You can do something, but in the short run, you can't do much, to be fairly honest. Because we have in Austria, we did a survey in 2021, and we have been doing this survey about the desired number of children for quite some decades. And in Austria, we have a two-child norm, And as you said already, it's true that they don't reach their desired number of children, and this is so true for women who have higher educational degrees, because it's harder for them to enter the labor market, to have safer jobs. You want to have support, you want to have childcare, you want to have an understanding employer who puts you back in labor. So there's a small number of factors where you can do something, but it's a long stretch. It's a long pathway, and all these norms, they're very much ingrained in our brains. That's something we have learned a very, very long way.
Today we are hosted by Kaffeesatz, a nice community place and cafe at the house Gleis 21 in the heart of Sonnenviertel in Vienna. Bring your children, bring your grandma and everybody you know, because they have great coffee and a nice shop in there as well. See you there. I think it's important to also say that the whole idea of the nuclear family is a phantasmagoria, so to say, because it was never the dominant pattern in which people live their lives. So it's a very young institution, but it is a strong institution right now. This is how a lot of people imagine their lives. So Gerlinde, please tell me about this very gendered aspect of care and what you have observed there.
I'm an expert in parental leave research, and Austria is So we have rather generous parental leave regulations, which provide both parents with the opportunity to take leave. However, we also know that men especially take the income-related form, which provides them with a kind of good income, although it's not an income. And I interviewed both parents 2 times, and we know that also in longitudinal research that fathers, even if they were on parental leave, are not always good in taking up mental load. It's rather women, and that's why we know that we have a high number of part-time employment for women in Austria, because to be involved, and there is this specific term, intensive parenting, it's nearly impossible with full-time employment. And in my research, when both parents worked part-time, they had the highest share in sharing more or less equally. And also in building up bonds with the child, so that the child does not only go to the mother if there is something very difficult, but also goes to the father and asks the father for support. So that's a very specific group of parents. But we know in Austria we have several changes. We have low rates in primary education. It was more or less built up after the European Union directives came. So this term intensive parenting, it's not the personal choice of parents, but they are obliged to find a kindergarten, they are obliged to find schooling. And then you have again to make a choice with 14. So intensive parenting, it's not by choice, but you always have to find a solution. And in my research, I observed that it's especially women who start very early thinking about where is a childcare facility, how can I arrange this and that. And we have also fathers who think a lot about it. So it's difficult, and in Austria, that's my final point, there is a lot of work in making arrangement in the individual area, and we have generous parental leave regulations. But the last Minister of Family Affairs, she always said, I don't want to rule into people's personal space. I don't want to have an obligation for fathers to go on leave. But that means that every couple and also single parents, they have to make a choice how to survive.
Yeah, but what is very specific about the Austrian situation, that the childcare is growing, so we have more supply, and the supply is there, but it supports only part-time employment of women. That means that, it cannot always be the most elaborate job you're doing in a part-time employment. So women are returning more and more to the labor market, but only part-time, and that inhibits their chances in the labor market in the longer run. So there's this child gap that prevents you from having a career.
Let me be a bit pedestrian here, because so many of us, so much of the time, don't work for a career either. We work because we have to make a living. And this applies especially to low-income households and especially to single parents, who combined constitute a huge portion of society. So we're not working because we're selfish and we want to make something out of ourselves, although I still don't regard that as selfish, wanting an actual career that you're proud of. But the majority of us work because we need money to sustain those families. So this kind of demonization of women leaving the household, it's a sort of Victorian conceived idea of a very thin layer of bourgeois society where households could afford for a mother to quote unquote stay at home, which then evolves through time and disregards the work that the woman does in the household, if they do, or disregards the circumstances that would allow somebody to be out of the labor market or just not be earning money. But there seems to be a very strong, not just populist, but also practical push across the region, especially the east of Europe and across much of Asia, where the population decline is pressing on societies and especially on governments. Russia has been struggling with a population decline, well, for many, many decades, actually. And now you have researched mostly Eastern European, Central Eastern European countries.
Tell us about how this fares in politics.
But if a society is more traditional, people are actually nowadays less likely to have children. And I think this is very, unusual, first of all, surprising, but also important in contextualizing some of these topics that we're talking about, because it means that, luckily, social norms nowadays have reached a certain level where women are not willing to compromise on their career. So if they feel that they're experiencing pressure from society, then, if anything, they're likely to have fewer children. And then the second, not so optimistic stat comes from South Korea, actually, where they looked at the period after the government made parental leave more gender equal, so increasing the share of father days in parental leave packages. It actually had an anti-natalist effect, unfortunately, because the more time fathers spent with their kids, they realized they didn't want to do childcare, and then they ended up having fewer children. And I'm definitely not saying this.
Sorry, that sounds horrendous.
Yeah,
they just realized they don't want these kids around anymore.
And obviously, I'm not saying this to defend those fathers, but I'm just trying to make the point that social norms have to move hand in hand with policy. Policy can't achieve everything. It can't be a silver bullet.
There seems to be a huge disconnect between the expectations and even worldviews between genders within even the same generations.
And that's how I interpret the South Korea finding as well. It's clear that fathers don't have a clue, basically, what it means to become a parent. And when they do, they realize that, their preferences might change. So it's all about the underlying societal norms, I suppose. In terms of your political question, we do see this phenomenon in Central and Eastern Europe. And I mentioned earlier, with the possible exception of the Meloni government in Italy, all the kind of famous usual suspects of pronatalism in Europe right now come from Central and Eastern Europe. And they're very ideologically homogeneous, much more likely to be right-wing. And we see that it brings them a lot of political dividends, right? Because usually these are also populations which, on average, remain much more traditional. They're more likely to view childbearing as a duty towards God, as a means, if you like, of living the good life the way they see it. And when you hear politicians' rhetoric about this, they don't talk about some of the things that we mentioned earlier, the kind of progressive reasons for pronatalism. They don't talk about the future shortage of workers if fertility stays low. Maybe they mention it in passing, but they're much more likely to focus, to kind of even guilt trip people into having children, if you like. It's actually easier for conservative politicians to make this argument nowadays because they can point to hard numbers and then interpret them in a very specific ideological manner. But the example that I wanted to give with Poland is that even though the policy that they have, one of the most famous ones in Europe, the Family 500 Plus, very generous financial benefit for parents, it started as it was proposed by the previous far-left economically but very conservative socially government. And now it has been extended by the progressive government, which originally was opposing the policy. So we see this a lot. I mean, of course, usually these policies are very clearly targeted at larger families. So the benefits are larger, the financial packages are more generous for large families. And we know from sociology, it's one of the most well-established truths in family policy that it is usually less educated people who have 3 or 4 children, and these are also the same kind of people who are more likely to vote for conservative parties. So you see this pattern kind of shaping up here and how politically beneficial this can be for conservative parties.
They are also more likely to benefit less from these subsidies, which at least across the region and primarily in Hungary focus on tax cuts, so it proportionately benefits the high earners, on housing top-ups, so let's say real estate buying top-ups, which are only accessible to people above a certain income, which I find particularly insane. They are limited above a certain number of children. And as you also point out in your article, they always target bigger families, which are less realistic to happen. How would you try and talk about this with a decision maker if they came to you? Do decision makers come to you and ask about your research?
Well, in statistics, we're here for the numbers. We're not here to interpret or give advice, So I think this is not something I feel like I'm good at advising policymakers what they should do. Because at the end of the day, if you're conservative or not, it's what you want to achieve can be very different. But there is one thing you really should be careful about, because we have an aging population, right? So we have all the baby boomers who are about to retire in the next decade. But if you say a baby is born today, so it will be economically active in the labor market, let's say, in 18, in 20, in 25 years. So it's a long time, so until the child becomes productive for the society. So you're on the squeeze from the elderly population. As a society, you have to take care for. And you also, let's say we manage to raise fertility now. You have to educate the babies, you have to put them to creche, you have to put them to preschool, so you're on the squeeze from the elderly population. So this is not necessarily something which is beneficial from a budgetary point of view, because it takes a long time, so you reap the benefits of a high number of babies, and that's something we should be careful about.
Display Europe is the force behind this project. It's a brand new content sharing platform that offers you articles, podcasts and videos about European culture, politics and community in 15 different languages. And yes, they also don't abuse your user data. I know it's a shocker. Go check them out at displayeurope.eu. And now let's get back to the conversation.
I think we can't really pass by the notion that our expectations and the level of involvement in parenting. So do you see this kind of intensive parenting in a more sort of historical context? Can you tell us about how this is changing and whether you think it contributes to this issue?
If both parents would work 30 hours, so there are colleagues, I'm not specialist in sociology of work and employment, but there is this vote for working 30 hours as a full-time employment, because a lot of problems also to raise children would decrease. And it would be called full-time employment and not part-time employment. And there is also this, how many hours a day can you be productive? Is it 6 hours or 8 hours or 10 hours? So intensive parenting, I know it's not the, it's a wide answer, but intensive parenting is a problem if you are expected to do something else. If you would say in a caring society, so that's Joan Tronto's work, caring democracies, you would have time to care for others. Also to care for older relatives, so it's not only children, it's also, and we have the more and more physically and psychologically handicapped people after COVID, so that's also the peer group is not always productive. So I always have problems with economic growth, because yes, we need economic growth, but what are the costs of economic growth? Costs in terms of, and I think the term intensive parenting is shaped by all these economic demands, because you would not call it intensive parenting if there were another caring system in our society.
But then we come around all the time to the question of pensions and social expenditure and all of that. And we hear, especially from progressives, like, how are we going to sustain our pension funds? Is there really no other way to even dream of pension funding or social care than funding through current specific schemes? Is there another possibility for an economic makeup?
So there was this famous quote, often misinterpreted, I would argue, by John Maynard Keynes from back in the day, when he said that he was expecting by our time, by our age, or maybe even already a few decades ago, that people would be able to only work 4 days a week. I personally, I think I'm not sure where I stand on this, definitely more towards the middle, in the sense that you mentioned that your mother was able to retire at 55, and that was great, but some people would answer that, you know, we can still have that nowadays, but then we would have to go to the living standard from 30 years ago, and a lot of people wouldn't be happy with that. So we live in a materialistic world. Maybe I'm being too cynical here, but I think it's probably important, because at the risk of sounding too technical, we know that economic growth is always, you know, a function of labor, capital, and productivity. Unless capital and productivity go up dramatically, which productivity might with technology, but we're not seeing it happen very fast, then we do need to keep labor constant. And there are, as you said, several ways to do that. Raising fertility is not the only way, probably not the best way either, because in the meantime, it only exacerbates the problem by the time these children are old enough to actually contribute to our societies and systems. So we have immigration on the table, but we know how politically unpopular it can be. We know what has been happening in Western countries for the last couple of years. We know that progressive governments have been losing elections everywhere because they happen to be more open to immigration than the average voter. I was, for example, advising the South Korean government on this a couple of weeks ago now, and even though their demographic reality is even more unfavorable than many West European countries, I was able to point to this clear silver lining of automation, right? Because they do seem to lead, in terms of automation. And in Eastern Europe, we don't have a lot of automation, and yet we have the same demographic negative realities that South Korea is facing. So automation can help. Labor market adaptation, as they call it, again, we're coming back to raising the retirement age, and we've seen how unpopular it can be. I don't have a clear solution to that, but it does remind us yet again that pronatalism and population aging more broadly are topics that progressives should be at least as concerned with as more conservative people.
But as you say, this is a national context that always has to be taken into account. It's not something you can say, oh, that's the remedy, and that the South Korean model works for Austria. Certainly not, And as what we see from Southeast Asia is that they're closed societies that don't accept immigration at all. So we are quite progressive in this respect, and they have fertility rates below the 1. So there's something like 0.7. It's unimaginable in Austria. So we have to find our own role. We have to find our role models from men and taking care, and so we are in a changing society, and the literature always suggests that you should consider a little bit of everything. There's not this one solution, right? So you cannot say, oh, let's not raise the pension age. We have to tackle this issue from all different perspectives. We also, our life expectancy has been growing up to 84 for women and almost 80 for men, and we expect it to rise even more so. So we are a changing society, and our models have to change in the same time. I think the huge problem is that what we have is the labor force, right? Women are very important for the labor force. This part-time issue, so we have to. It should be in our focus, not necessarily only to raise, to have many babies, but to tackle our demographic problem is also that we have to bring women to a higher amount into the labor force, and we have to help them to bring up their children, that they don't have to bribe the neighbor or the government next door. So we really have to tackle the issue from many different perspectives to be successful.
Gerlinde, I interrupted you there. You said you were asked about how they should change gender norms. Did they take your advice? What was your advice?
Yeah. Authorities aim to raise numbers of men also in public childcare and in primary education. But again, so even with parents on leave, there is this focus on income. And if income in care and in primary care is low, it's mostly done by women.
Just to get back to, potential solutions, there's also a Finnish model of investing the money of God in King Solomon in education and then keeping your babies in a cardboard box. I think there is also a strong element of reconfiguring a very consumerist approach to things that you need around a baby, because let's be honest, a young baby needs the least things, and that's when we are driven to buy and consume, because that's a way to connect with people, that you bring them baby clothes. If you're visiting, this is just a little advice to the viewers, if you're visiting parents with young children, with newborn babies, don't bring stuff for the baby, bring stuff for the parents. That's what they need. They already have the stuff for the baby. Bring them nappies, bring them food, bring them something that brings them joy, because it's a tough time. And it would be great if they could get to enjoy that as well.
Parental leave, childcare, especially more gender equal parental leave, policies targeted at making part-time work easier, but also making the transition from part-time work to full-time work, as we mentioned earlier, easier. These are perhaps very boring kind of, classical policy approaches, but they're still important even in today's world, on top of some of the considerations that I mentioned earlier. And in Serbia, when you look at the effects of their pronatalist policy, and they have been very effective percentage-wise in raising the fertility rate for those categories of families. But as a contribution to the overall fertility rate of the nation, some estimates suggest that it added no more than 100 children per year to the country. So clearly you can't solve the fertility issues, challenges, only by focusing on large families. It has to be
and
more
only on
balanced.
focusing on wealthy people already, as we have talked. So when subsidies are targeted at well-off people, that's not going to move the needle to the extent. And if they are not factored to address actual needs and they're just a luxury contribution, then that's probably not going to be a solution there.
Yeah, I want to bring up one other topic is that we always look at period fertility, and now I'm the one being technical. This is the fertility we're observing today, right? So at this moment, what we have been experiencing for the last decade is that women are having babies later in their life. Let's say born in the late 70s or early 80s, it's not like they're having only 1.3 children, but they still have close to 1.6 in fact. And this is because they're having babies later in their life. But what happens if you're having babies or trying to have babies later in your life, that it becomes more difficult biologically. But you know, if you're crashing the 40s and want to have a baby, it might become difficult and you really need assisted reproduction. And that can be quite pricey. So if you really want to help families and women and couples to have more babies, there should be subsidies and there should be aids to help women and couples to have babies with financial support so they can have the babies they want.
And maybe our economies will also have to be adjusted for a system where we're not in this perpetual growth ideal, which is actually wrecking our future perspectives. And many of us don't dare to have more children because we're not sure we will be able to protect them from disaster. Thank you so much, all of you. And I hope to see you in the playground soon.
Now we want to know, what do you think of depopulation? Have you given birth this week yet? And if not, when are you planning to? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're already rummaging down there, give us a like and subscribe to our channel. This talk show is presented by Eurozine, and if you haven't heard of it, you should check it out right now, because this online magazine trades in a scarcity item, and that's insight. Eurozine publishes thoughtful long-form articles from more than 100 partner journals across dozens of European languages, and you have access to it all for free. Display Europe is the force behind this project. It's a content-sharing platform that offers you articles, podcasts, and videos about European politics, culture, and general life in 15 different languages. And yes, they also don't abuse your user data. I know it's unbelievable, yet true. Go check it out at displayeurope.eu. This program is co-funded by the Creative Europe program of the European Union and the European Culture Foundation. Importantly, the views and opinions expressed here are those of the speakers and the authors only. They do not necessarily reflect those of the European Union or the European Education and Culture Executive Agency. Neither the European Union nor the EACA can be held responsible for them. Like, not that we would mind them taking advice from us.